Did you know that 51% of small business owners list managing cash flow as one of their top pain points? Did you also know that your local credit union has business solutions to ease that pain? Greenville Federal Credit Union now offers treasury management and merchant services that fit your business. From wire transfers, ACH transactions, and even remote deposit capture, we're here to help you manage your cash flow efficiently. To get started, visit greenvillefcu.com. That's greenvillefcu.com. Member eligibility rules apply. Member NCUA.
Hello, your friendly neighborhood host, JT Wheatley, here again back for another episode of History Comics Podcast, this time with the history of Fiction House. At the beginning of the golden age of comic books in America, there were numerous publishers attempting to cash in on a new medium. Some were pulp publishers, which is where both DC and Marvel originally came from, and even published sister comics to their pulps. Of no exception was Fiction House, a pulp publisher who joined the comic book scene just months after Action Comics #1 debuted, but made it significant with its many possessive stance at the time. From hiring numerous talented female creators and even one of the first few black comic book creators, along with featuring strong female characters in general, and not only on the covers but starring their own features, it was a company that pushed comic book storytelling at the time. However, it was this very boundary pushing that also brought about the ire of the censors, leading to its downfall. Fiction House was founded by John W. Glenister, who was born on January 11, 1874, in the Lower East Side of New York. As a boy, Glenister sold papers at age 9 as the start of his first business. At 14, he hitchhiked to Chicago and Nebraska, working various jobs along the way, such as hash slinger, actor, producer, and amateur boxer. Swimming was Glenister's real passion, though, and as he grew up, he became an Olympic-class swimmer and one of the first celebrity athletes, making headlines swimming across the English Channel in 1897. That same year, Glenister began swimming competitively, winning a $250 purse against Professor J.B. Starch from Narragansett Pier to Newport. On August 18, 1903, Glenister gained international celebrity when he became the first man to swim the Niagara Falls, nearly dying in the process. Glenister would admit years later in an interview that he didn't so much swim as he kept his head above water and his lungs full of air. After this near-suicide attempt, Glenister was a worldwide star, and with his newfound celebrity, he made money endorsing his product, his nerve tonics. Glenister would also use his newfound celebrity to move to the business world, and in 1919, he became the vice president of Warner Publications in New York, producer of pulp magazines and no relation to Warner Brothers, the movie studio. In a few years, Glenister decided to set out on his own, so on April of 1921, he formed his own company, Fiction House, with John Burns, Jack Riley, located at 461 8th Avenue in New York City. The company's first pulp would be Action Stories, and within 4 years, it reached 150,000 in circulation, ultimately running for 224 issues until 1950. Fiction House was first publicly mentioned in the New York Times article that April 15th, and soon would add other pulps such as Air Stories, Aces, and Planet Stories, which would feature writers like Ray Bradbury, Philip K. Dick, and Gardner Fox, along with artists including A.C. Hollingsworth, Graham Ingalls, and Maurice Whitman, covering genres from aviation to westerns to science fiction. Fiction House also expanded the line by acquiring other pulps, such as Frontier Stories from Doubleday, Doran, and Company. While Fiction House was growing, Glenister was active in politics, forming the People's Voice League with the New York Tribune on August 7, 1922, in protest against Prohibition, which is where he earned his Bearcat nickname. Barnstorming across America to rally against Prohibition, Glenister also became the public face of Fiction House, with many joking he could have starred in one of his magazines due to his looks. Fiction House itself would get political, as would Fight Stories, that profiled real-life boxers when it focused on Joe Chernetsky in 1930, a Jewish boxer never giving a title shot due to his ethnicity. Despite success against champion boxers, he beat both James Jeffries and Jack Johnson before they went on to become champions. Fiction House champions Chernetsky's story, a progressive move unheard of in the 1920s and 30s, and one of the many that would become a staple of the company. Glenister also pushed to bring a fighter from the Old Sod, Ireland, as Glenister was proud of his Irish heritage, to reclaim the boxing title for Irish Americans, even recruiting former welter and middleweight boxing champion Tommy Ryan to do so. They are unable to find a boy of 19 years old, 250 pounds, and unspoiled by city life, as an article of April 4th, 1930 Los Angeles Times read, but it was another example of how the Bearcat lived his life. That same year, Glenister started to hand over operations to his son-in-law, Thurman T. Scott, who married his daughter, Jacqueline Emma, back in 1928. Scott was first made secretary of Fiction House in 1930, and by 1938 he became publisher. However, Scott would have trouble early in his reign as of December 28, 1932, when it was bluntly announced that Fiction House was ending its pulp, such as Aces, Detective Classics, and Wings, despite previous sales of 150,000 an issue. The public story was that the Depression had caused them to be canceled, but behind the scenes, the reason was much more personal. Jack Kelly, Glenester's business partner, died on April 4, 1932, and his widow sought her husband's shares in cash, which would have forced Fiction House to liquidate. In the legal battle, Fiction House was forced to suspend its operations until it was settled. By 1933, a settlement was reached, and Fiction House was up and running again with its pulps being re-released in January of 1934. On October 17 of 1937, John Glenister died from a stroke in Santa Monica, California, 6 months after the death of his wife, Julia. With his son-in-law Thurman T. Scott now fully in charge, he launched Fiction House's comics line with Jumbo Comics No. 1 in September 1938 under their Real Adventures Publishing Company imprint. Much of this was produced by Will Eisner and Jerry Iger, who partnered back in 1937 before Eisner and Iger Studios, also known as the Syndicated Features Company. The idea for the company was a comic book packager that they produced comic features on demand to numerous publishers looking to enter the growing comic book medium and fill their comic books they were putting out. Soon, Eisner and Iger became the go-to comic producers at the time and essential to Fiction House's growing comic book line. Appearing in Jumbo Comics No. 1 was Fiction House's most significant character, Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, who first appeared in Joseph P. Power's British magazine, Wags. She was created by Will Eisner, Jerry Iger, and Mort Meskin. It will be one of the several features reused from Wags by Eisner and Iger. Jumbo Comics No. 1, cover dated September of 1938, but actually hit the stands on July 12th, reused material from Wags for the first 8 issues, which averaged 68 pages at just the cost of 10 cents per purchase, and also featured work by Bob Kane and Jack Kirby. This all came about when Will Eisner approached Thurman Scott, now the head of Fiction House, on the idea of reprinting the tabloid-sized plates as a giant comic book like they did with Wags. The comic came out at perfect time as it hit the stands 3 months after Action Comics No. 1, leading to the explosion of the comic book medium in America. However, because the material from Wags was black and white, Jumbo Comics would be the same for those first 8 issues before going full color with issue number 9. In addition, those first 8 issues were printed in a larger format of 10.5 by 14.5 inches, thus the name Jumbo Comics, before reverting to the standard comic book size at the time of 8.5 to 10.5 inches with issue number 9. The last big Jumbo Comics would be released in the 1939 World's Fair in New York, serving as a commemorative issue. With the success of Jumbo Comics, Fiction House set out to expand its comics line, publishing 3 titles cover dated January 30th, Fight Comics, Planet Comics, and Jungle Comics. That September, it produced Wing Comics. In October of 1941, it published Rangers of Freedom Comics. This was the form of the Big Six of Fiction House's comics line until 1954, and while the Fiction House also produced 26 other comic book titles in a total of 825 separate issues, these would be the most significant. In 1940, John Jack Byrne took over Fiction House when Scott went into semi-retirement due to ill health. He was a prolific writer and editor, having worked in Fiction House in the pulp division from 1928 to 1934, editing nearly the entire line from Aces to Wings. He left the company in 1936 to become editor at Argosy magazine, considered the original pulp, for the Frank A. Mumsey's company until 1937. When Scott retired, Byrne returned to Fiction House, where he served as co-publisher with Malcolm Riss. In addition, Byrne had another comic book connection, as his sister Olive was the domestic partner with William Moulton Marston, the inventor of the lie detector and the co-creator of Wonder Woman, who lived with him and his wife, and they had 2 children with him, along with Moulton's wife's and his wife's children as well. Like his sister, Jack Byrne's aunt was also Margaret Sanger, the noted feminist and birth control activist of the 1900s as well. Malcolm Rice joined in 1931 with Fiction House with his story The Cover-Up Shot, which appeared in the September issue of Northwest Stories, a Canadian Western pulp. By 1933, Rice was a full-time editor working for Fiction House in the 1960s, a decade after the company ceased publishing magazines. After 1954, Rice handled Fiction House's intellectual property, such as Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, which would later be developed into movies and TV. Fiction House did undergo a significant change with its comic book line when Will Eisner ended his partnership with Jerry Iger, sharing his sales in the company in 1939 to focus on producing the Spirit comic. Now run solely by Jerry Iger, the new S&M Iger Studios would continue to produce 50% of Fiction House's comics line. While Scott had an excellent working relationship with Iger, he also built up Fiction House's internal staff and would employ artists like George Tuska, Ruth Atkinson, and Matt Baker. Notable for comic book companies and businesses in general at the time, Fiction House employed a number of talented female artists and writers. This will be reflected in their stories, as characters like Sheena and Firehair were strong, independent heroines able to stand alongside the likes of Wonder Woman and their male counterparts. They also took pride in their sexuality and beauty, seeing no reason to hide it. Of course, profits were a motive behind this as well, as Scott knew a beautiful woman on the cover helped sell magazines, and personally approved nearly every one of Fiction House's covers under his tenure. This was part of Fiction House's aim to an older, more diverse audience than normal comic books, whose fans consisted mostly of young boys at the time. When Jack Byrne and Malcolm Reese took over, they continued this, realizing the popularity of strong women, as the movies in the 1940s featured female stars as Lauren Bacall and Ingrid Bergman, more than a match for their male co-stars Humphrey Bogart and James Cagney. Of note, Virginia Mayo of the classic film The Best Years of Our Lives was Warner Brothers' top box office draw in the late 1940s. Reese and Byrne knew this would translate to comics, and as did their numerous female creators they employed. The lineup of talented creators included Nina Albright, Gina Leap, and Ann Brewster, many of whom were hired during World War II, as most of their male counterparts were drafted, including Will Eisner, in the service. Of note, they would fill nearly every role as well at Fiction House, from lettering to editors. Aubrey Tony Bloom worked at Fiction House with her father, Alex, while also working along with Classic Illustrated. Her mother, Helen, was an award-winning artist, and thus Aubrey would carry on the family tradition. She worked under many pen names, probably the most for any comic book creator, using names like Tony Bloom, Tony Boone, and Anthony Bloom. Not only to disguise the fact that she was a female to male readers, but a classic technique that many other comic creators at the time used, such as Will Eisner and Jack Kirby, as it made it look like the books were employing a lot more creators than they actually were. She started out working at Eisner and Iger and was almost certainly the first female contributor to Fiction House, with her work appearing in the early issues of Jumbo Comics in 1938 and 39, with features like The Count of Monte Cristo and The Diary of Dr. Hayward. She also wrote features like Lady Luck in 1940, while ghost scripting The Spirit in 1942 for Will Eisner. While at Eisner and Iger, Bloom created Sally O'Neill, Policewoman, with Chuck Maglione, and Prop Powers and Wonder Boy with John Stileredo. While Bloom contributed full script, she also worked by writing outlines for the artists, working with them on panel breakdowns, and when they produced a comic, filling in the dialogue afterwards. It was the early Marvel method of writing that Stan Lee would perfect at Marvel Comics in the 1960s, only done by a woman decades earlier. Bloom would later work for Quality Comics on features like The Black Condor, Doll Man, and Uncle Sam from 1940 to 43, while also serving as a nurse during World War II. At Eisner and Iger, she was second only to Will Eisner in producing scripts, and he thought so highly of her he cited her as Aubrey Budd in his work The Dreamer, a thinly disguised autobiographical trade paperback about his career in the 1930s. Ruth Roche was born on February 18, 1917, and started out as a writer at Eisner and Iger, later becoming an associate editor. She became a full business partner with Jerry Iger after Will Eisner left their partnership in 1939, and the studio became Roche and Iger till 1961 when it ceased operations. She also used numerous working aliases like Miss Thorpe, Andres Wilson, and Rod Roche, while helping write and develop Sheena in her early adventures. Rose also worked at Fox Feature Syndicate in the Farrell publication of The Phantom Lady, and partnered with Matt Baker on The Flamingo, a comic strip that featured a female lead, running from 1952 to 53. Of interesting note, in 1944, she co-created the first Muslim superhero with artist Chuck Winter with Kismet, Man of Fate, first appearing in Bomber Comics #1 in March of 1944 under the alias Omar Tanan. That same year, Iger and Rose formed Action Play Books, writing books like Adventures of Peter Pulp, Bobby's Diary, and Indian Legends. Rose passed away on May 4, 1983, leaving behind a legacy of one of the earlier innovators of writing during the golden age of comic books. Nina Dorothy Albright was born on February 15, 1907, in Manhattan, New York, graduating from the Pratt Institute in 1927. She would work at Fiction House from 1943 to 1944 through Iger Studios, having answered a classified ad for the company. There she worked on Senorita Rio, Inspector Dayton, and Captain Terry Thunder. She also worked for L.B. Cole Studios, Funnies Incorporated, and Bernard Bailey Studios. Arbert would produce 100 uncredited stories from 1943 to 54, later producing Polly French of Whitford High from 1954 to 56. She also illustrated for All-American Girl magazine, textbooks, and paperbacks. While Iger Studios did provide 50% of their comic book production, Fiction House had many in-house creators on staff as well, and more than a few of them were women. A notable one was Ruth Atkinson, who was Fiction House's art director and expert in drawing airplanes, as demonstrated with her work on Wings Comics number 42 on February of 1944 with her story Wingtips. Atkinson would also draw for Jungle Comics and Planet Comics before leaving Fiction House in 1945 and the art director position because she found it too ironically left her little time for actual artwork. Atkinson went to work at Timely, the future Marvel Comics, where she created Millie the Marlowe and Patsy Walker, that would later become the comic book character Hellcat. Anne Brewster, whose real name was Shuya Sirno-Sivoix, was great at drawing beautiful women, thus Robert Webb put her on Sheena, as Webb would later admit he wasn't as good at drawing females. She started as an artist and inker at Binder Comics in 1942, then worked for Harry A. Chesler, who gave Will Eisner his first job, and then later Jerry Iger in 1944. Marilee Mercy was a writer and office manager, sometimes ghostwriting for The Spirit Sunday installment. For Fiction House, Mercer co-created and wrote the feature The Secret Files of Dr. Drew with artist Jerry Grandinetti, which originally ran in Ranger Comics, but soon became so popular it was reprinted in Fire Hair, Monster, and Ghost Comics. Fran Hopper joined Fiction House in 1942, having spent 2 years at the Pratt Institute. Her first official credit was under the name Fran Dietrich on Planet Comics number 24 on the 6-page feature Norge Benson, which she penciled and inked. After her marriage to Dr. John B. Hopper, she listed her name as Fran Hopper, with her first known work under that name being Monkey Business, The Tree Folk of Africa, and Jungle Comics number 53, and Gail Allen in Planet Comics number 30, both in May of 1944. Hopper also worked on features like Glory Forbes, Mist of the Moon, Camilla, Jane Martin War Nurse, and Gail Allen. She would leave Fiction House in 1947. Jean Lavender did production work, with most of her artwork being uncredited, though she did contribute to Ranger Comics and Planet Comics, along with inking many of the other features as well. She would later provide artwork for Holly Oak Publishing Company's Sparkling Stars in number 15 and 16 in 1946. Lena Boffalente was born on October 27, 1924 in Vicenza, Italy, and is considered the first European female artist to work on American comics with Sky Rangers and Sheena, Queen of the Jungle. This was due to Iger Studios outsourcing some of its artwork to Italy, thus making its way to Fiction House. She would continue to work into the 1990s in such comics as The Piccolo Ranger and Commandant Mark, and then passed away on March 6, 2007 at the age of 82. Marcia Snyder worked at Fiction House from 1944 to 45 on Camilla and Taboo, Wizards of the Jungle, and U.S. Rangers. She would enjoy a lengthy career in comics, magazine covers, and commercial art, working in the 1960s before retiring. Of all the female creators at Fiction House, though, Lily Renee would be the most significant, considering that she was one of the few to ever draw a cover and is the most celebrated of all of them. Born in Vienna, Austria, May 12, 1921, to Jewish parents, she avoided the Holocaust, arriving in England in 1938 at the age of 14. One of 10,000 Jewish children to do so thanks to the Jewish World Relief Effort. She eventually arrived in New York, where her parents had immigrated to, and where she worked as a model while attending night school at the Art Students League and School of Visual Arts. In 1942, on the encouragement of her mother, who stated she needed to draw Tarzan and Jane, Renee applied to Fiction House, where Thurman Scott instantly noticed her. It helped that she was a young, attractive woman at the time, but when he saw her portfolio, he hired her on a 2-week trial period at $18 a week. Those 2 weeks would turn into 5 years. Renee started at Fiction House doing cleanup and background, something all unproven artists went through at the company. Even the great Frank Frazetta briefly did cleanups for the company. Later, she penciled Winning Comics number 31 and then made her mark on Werewolf Hunters. The feature began back in Ranger Comics number 8, one of the earliest horror stories in comics, focusing on werewolves and those who hunt them. However, Werewolf Hunters would flounder so badly that no one wanted it until Lily Renee got it. Under Renee, she convinced the writer to have the Werewolf Hunters focus move from werewolves to magic and shape-shifting in general. Soon, Werewolf Hunters became one of Fiction House's most popular features, and Lily Renee one of its most popular artists. Sadly, due to the time, Lily Renee faced the same harassment women in the workplace did throughout the world and at Fiction House. Despite progressive hiring practices, sexist attitudes still persisted there. Not every male at Fiction House was a harasser, with Nick Cardy reportedly sympathetic to her situation, and Renee did find help with her fellow female co-workers like Ruth Atkinson and Fran Hopper. Despite the sexist atmosphere, she continued to do great work, especially on Senorita Rio and Jane Martin stories. She left Fiction House in 1948, later working at St. John's and becoming a children's book author, such as The Red is the Heart and The Magic Next Door. To date, Lily Renee still lives in New York City at the age of 98, with many recently discovering her past work as a Golden Age comic book artist. Reportedly, her own grandchildren only found out a few years ago. While these many female artists definitely deserve to be mentioned, there are more than a few, of course, male artists at Fiction House in general, such as Murphy Anderson, Nick Cardy, Matt Baker, Al Feilstein, Lou Fine, and Maurice Whitman. Matt Baker was one of the first black artists in comic books, noted for his ability to draw beautiful women, and would later work at St. John's, penciling the digest-sized It Rhymes with Lust in 1950, considered a forerunner to the modern graphic novel. Murphy Anderson and Nick Cardy would help establish Fiction House look, and after leaving the company, go on to successful careers with Will Eisner and DC Comics. Al Feldstein would work through Iger Studios at Fiction House before he would go on to partner with Bill Gaines at EC Comics, later editing Mad Magazine. Lou Fine's first published work was in Jumbo Comics #4, featured Wilton of the West. It would go on to a successful career in advertising, while at Fiction House was one of his best cover artists, especially with the iconic cover of Planet Comics #1 in January of 1940. Maurice Whitman started at Fiction House in 1947, working on nearly every one of the company's comics, before moving on to Charlton, DC, Dell, and Warner Publishing. Of all these artists, one of Fiction House's most popular was Joseph Doolin, who was born on March 22, 1896 in Pontiac, Illinois. He joined the Army in 1914 but fell ill and received a disability discharge due to illness. Doolin would fully recover and later attend the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts, where Walt Disney and Brady Rogers trained under Billy DeBeck and Von Shoemaker. By 1925, he was providing art for the Chicago-based pulp Weird Tales, and in 1927 moved to New York City, where he did work for the pulps like Strange Stories, Air War, and Love Romances. Of these pulps were two of Fiction House's, Jungle and Planet Stories, soon becoming the go-to artist at Fiction House for all his comics, from covers to interior art. Doolin was exceptional at the female form, and he used himself as a model for male figures. His co-workers described him as having a bull neck and the shoulders of a wrestler. However, it was his talent that also forced him out of his comics, as the CCA regulated his sexy style out of the industry for the time, while also dealing with the stiff competition of movies and TV. Thus, Joseph Doolin turned to work on advertising before dying in August of 1961 at the age of 71 in Flushing, Queens, New York. And now that I've established all those many talented artists and writers and so forth that worked at Fiction House, we will leave you here for now, but join me again next week when we then get into the many brilliant comic books that Fiction House produced and why they left such an impact in the industry. And now is March 5th, 2026, time for the favorite comic of the week. Well, don't have one this week because work got a little crazy and wasn't able to make it to my comic book store yesterday for New Comic Day. But I have been able to check out some new comics. Particularly, I finally got around to reading the 1988 miniseries Batman the Cult by Jim Starlin and Bernie Wrightson, which is a very dark series that kind of rode the wave of the grim and gritty that was set off by The Dark Knight Returns from 1986 and so forth, in which Batman in this miniseries is basically kidnapped by a cult leader in an underground lair and starved and brainwashed and drugged and basically broken as this guy basically takes over Gotham, played by this mysterious Deacon Blackfire, who starts off, he's supposed to be like this religious guy helping the homeless, but then he proceeds to take over the city and starts killing everyone. And it's very dark and a very brutal series, almost a little too dark for Batman. The lengths they go through in this is a bit crazy. And yeah, it was definitely, you can see the edge of of the Dark Age, where they went too far pushing the grim and gritty of everything. Though I have to say, Bernie Wrightson's art is absolutely gorgeous. I mean, if you're going to do a dark and scary book, there's no one better than the late great Bernie Wrightson, who really delivers in this series. And it's out, even though it's not perfect, it's definitely worth checking out. So if you want to check out a nice, more of an offshoot of the Batman series, check out the Batman the Cult. And with that, we will conclude this episode of The Archives. Join me again next week for the part 2 of the History of Fiction House. And until then, go out and check yourself out a good comic book. And check out Batman the Cult. If you like Batman, it's pretty decent to read.